We have a rich lineup of speakers today, which I'm thrilled about, and so I'm not going to take up too much time. I'm very excited about this event. It's an auspicious occasion, the 100th anniversary of the May 4th movement, but it is also a year of anniversaries for China. We have Tiananmen, June 4th, the 30th anniversary. We have the creation of the People's Republic of China, the 70th anniversary coming up in October. And if we were to sort of think creatively, we could add one more anniversary, and that was the one-child policy came about in 1979, although it has been dismantled. So a year of anniversaries for China. Our group of scholars today will be primarily focusing on the effects of the May 4th movement and thinking about it in hindsight and how that momentous occasion was a turning point for China. But the reflection of where China is today will be very much part of forefront of some of the papers or talks that you're going to hear. I'm really interested in the May 4th new cultural movement, particularly after help to edit the book that Victor just pointed out to you. Some of the papers, chapters in that book, taught me about the rich feminist movement that was very much alive in China in 1919, and how that spoke to not as much about how Western scholarship has looked at this, which has usually been from male scholars from the West, looking at feminist scholars or feminist activists in China and embedding it in a nationalist platform. Usually it is talked about within that nationalist discourse and that kind of modern project that China was attempting to embark upon. And yet if you read other feminist scholars, female feminist scholars, Chinese feminist scholars, they write about the work of Chinese feminists back then and how their work spoke to a bigger picture of gender equity and bringing women out into the public domain, and really to challenge the Confucian patriarchal culture that was embedded in China at the time. And that, I think, for me, the May 4th movement is about that period when China was discussing so many different ideas, some Western, some not Western, and how that really reflects a kind of moving forward in society. A very exciting moment. So today, our speakers, they're not in the order that they're going to be, they're not sitting in the order that they're going to be speaking. We have Zhongping Chen is going to start us off. The May 4th, the New Cultural Movement, and Old Cultural Momentum, a Centennial Reflection. We are then going to go to Richard King. I should actually say Zhongping is with the History Department. Richard King, who has just recently retired from Pacific and Asian Studies, is going to give us a talk, Liu Xuan's Japanese Epiphany and May 4th Disillusion with China. That will be followed by Angie Chau, who is currently with Pacific and Asian Studies, and she is talking about rewriting Chinese literary history, the persistence of Liu Xuan and the May 4th movement. We will then go to Greg Blue, who is UVic History Department Emeritus Professor, who will be talking about rethinking the two-way street, John Dewey in China. Then we go to Chen Liu at the end of the table, who will be speaking about the self, the family, the nation in the May 4th and today, a comparison of the ideal of the family, followed by our China chair, Guo Guanglu, who is with both the History and Political Science departments, the Chinese tango between nationalism and democracy, May 4th and today in a comparison. As you can see, we have lots to talk about. I'm going to ask the speakers to try and stick to 10 minutes if you can. I know that's almost impossible. Victor's going to be our timekeeper. And we'll see how we go. We want to leave lots of room for discussion and questions at the end. So, Zhongping, over to you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this speech. And the title of my presentation, as you can see, is the May 4th the new cultural moment and older cultural impacts, a centennial reflection. Because I'm a historian and also I'm a first speaker, I think I have the obligation to provide a little historical background for the moment. So the May 4th movement happened because in the first of the war, Japan took the chance to seize the German concession in Shandong of China. That's a red one. In 1914. But after the First World War, at the Versailles Peace Conference, Western powers affirmed the Japanese control of the former German concession in Shandong in early 1919, and that led to the Beijing student protest on May 4th, 1919, and that further spread to the whole country as students, workers, and merchants protest until June 12th. By that time, the Beijing government had to let 3 pro-Japanese ministers resign, and also finally the China reject the Versailles Peace Treaty. So basically the movement achieved a success. But the scholars usually, these actually give the name of the May 4th movement, but the scholars usually also included the new cultural movement as part of the May 4th movement. That was started from 1915 until 1921 when the Chinese Communist Party was established, or until 1923 when the ideological debate of the May 4th era ended. So for this moment, a classical study by Chi Cheung and placed it as intellectual revolution in modern China. Another classical study by Liu Xuan and placed it as Chinese Enlightenment. As a leader of the movement itself, Hu Shi actually defined the movement as Chinese Renaissance, or the revitalization of traditional Chinese humanism and rationalism. More recently, one leading scholar in China called Li Zhihe, and he actually defined the movement as the variations on the double theme of Chinese Enlightenment and the national salvation. And he claimed this Chinese Enlightenment was interrupted and terminated by the national salvation theme. And so that is his argument. So for myself, I published one article, the May 4th movement and provincial warlords, a re-examination. So it was published in the journal Modern China, based in Los Angeles in 2011. In this article, basically I argue the May 4th movement succeeded not only because the students led the protest in the whole country, but also because the movement received support from many provincial warlords. Why did provincial warlords support the movement? Either they supported it because their factional fights against the Beijing regime, or because their native place attachment to Shandong province, or Shandong in northern China produced a lot of warlords at that time, or because their provincial domains were threatened by Japanese control of Shandong, so that's why their military provincialism led to their nationalism, so they support the movement. So this article actually raises questions for my speech today. The first question is, did the May 4th movement reflect the new culture as most scholars claim, or it actually reflects the traditional Chinese culture like a traditional factionalism, provincialism, or both? But the second question is, what is new culture? What is old culture? The common sense is the Chinese culture before 1915 would be considered old culture. And Chinese culture developed by the movement from 1915 should be called a new culture, right? So this is a common sense definition. But unfortunately, most scholars do not use this definition. Instead, they define Western imported culture as a new culture, and the traditional Chinese culture as old culture, like Confucianism. I think the second definition is used by most scholars is a narrow definition, and we actually should define old culture and new culture in both ways. And the third question is, did the older culture, either as a pre-1915 culture or as a traditional culture, had any impact on the new culture moment in the May 4th movement? So my speech basically will discuss three questions. Let's start from the older culture or the traditional culture on its impact on new cultural leaders. Let's start from number one culture, the leader of the new culture movement, Chen Cheung. If you look at Chen Cheu's life, in political life, he founded the journal New Youth in 1915. So that actually was the beginning of the new cultural movement, right? But in his personal life, in his older age at least, he accepted arranged marriage with Gao Xiaolan in 1897. And they actually together gave birth to three sons. Chen Cheung at least later broke away this Chinese cultural tradition, based on family system, and he eloped with Gao Xiaolan's younger sister, Gao Jingman, in 1910. But if you look at the second major leader of the new cultural movement, Hu Shi, if you look at him, and Hu Shi became famous because he studied in the United States between 1910 to 1917, and then he led the literary revolution in the new cultural movement, a major leader of the May 4th movement, right? But if you look at his personal life, he first accepted the arranged engagement with Jiang Dongxue in 1904. Certainly he was young at that time. But the funny thing is that after he went to the United States, received Western style education, went back to China, became the professor of Beijing University, he still went back, accepted the arranged marriage with the same woman, Jiang Dongxue, in 1917. Certainly later, he never loved this woman. He later actually fell in love and lived with Jiang Dongxue's young cousin, Chau for 3 months in 1923, and then he went back to demand a divorce with his wife. But because his wife threatened if he divorced him, she would use 6 to kill their 3 children one by one. He backed up. Let's look at third major leader, Liu Xuan. We knew Liu Xuan went to Japan to study medicine at first, but later he realized the major problem with the Chinese was not in their body, but that was in their mind. So that's why he changed the major to literature and tried to use literature to cure Chinese mind. And so that's why he published the first vernacular novel, the Diary of a Madman, in 1918. In this novel, he attacked Confucianism as cannibalism or man-eating culture, because Confucianism does require, that's the meaning, 6 minutes. Okay. That's the meaning, the Confucianism required, the children to sacrifice themselves for their parents, and required wives to sacrifice them for the husband. And he claimed that was a man-eating culture. But he actually personally accepted this man-eating culture, because when he was in Japan, he was called back by his widow mother in 1903 and accepted arranged marriage with Zhuan. He never actually, according to him, he never actually slept with this woman. Later, he fell in love and lived with one of his female students, Zhongping, from 1927 until 1936 when he died. But he still kept Zhuan in his family. So this just reflect the older culture impact on their personal life. Right now I'll discuss how the older culture, pre-1915 culture, affected their political ideas. Let's start from Chen Cheung. Chen Cheung became famous because he promoted Mr. Democracy and Mr. Science. But actually before him, Kang Yi-wei, as the famous legislative reform, led the 1890 reform, he already proposed the Ziduzhe, or the Bureau of Institutions. So he actually planned to use this bureau to select the talents nationwide and discuss national policies. This was a typical, at least a primitive democratic institution, right? And also, after the 1898 reform, he fled to Canada, and on the small island, the Coal Island, east to Sydney, he completed an important work called called national salvation through material upbuilding. And in this article, he basically argued the secret of Western power, and the only way for Chinese national salvation was use the scientific instrument. That article was complete in 1904. So in other words, Chen Cheu's idea about Mr. Democracy, Mr. Science was not totally new. Kang Yi promoted the same idea for decades, right? It was new only in the sense Chen Tuxi actually promoted individual liberalism rather than democratic institution. He originally did not use the mixed idea, mixed democracy. He originally used the idea of human rights. And also he promoted not the scientific instrument, as Kang Youwei did, he actually promoted a scientific outlook for analysis of society, for the transformation of Chinese society. So that actually was new. And let's go back to Kang Youwei. Kang Youwei was typical older cultural leader because starting from 1898 reform, he proposed that Confucianism should become a national religion of China. And in particular, in 1917, he joined the warlord in the imperial restoration of the last emperor of China against the Republican China. So he was a typical older cultural leader, but he actually was a strong supporter of the May 4th movement protest in 1919. Let's move to another case, Hu Shi. I will not discuss Liu Xuan. I should.
Well, just wrap.
Okay, I try to finish in 2 minutes. Sorry. So Hu Shi led the literary revolution mainly because he tried to use this revolution to end classical Chinese in writing and instead use vernacular speech as a basis of Chinese writing. But actually before him, Liang Qizhou as another older cultural leader, and he actually was a leader and a propagandist for literature reform and later for early Republican democracy. And he already created this half classical and half vernacular writing style for intellectuals. So in other words, Hu Shi's idea of a literary revolution was not totally new. Somebody actually, Liang Qizhou already did that before him. It was just a continuity of Liang Qizhou's work. It was new only in the sense it promoted popular Chinese writing style and popular Chinese culture. By the way, back to Liang Qizhou, he was a typical older cultural leader during the May 4th movement because after the First World War, he toured Europe and he felt so disappointed. He originally was admirer of Western civilization, but during this tour, he felt so disappointed at Western culture civilization, and he felt so disgusted at the larger scale massacre during the First World War. So that's why he turned away from the so-called Western science in bankruptcy toward the traditional Chinese idea about the people-based polity or Minbenzuyi and to traditional Chinese collectivism. Actually, it was Liang Qizhou as the older cultural leader who first reported the Shandong issue from Paris to China on April 24th. And his telegram actually triggered the May 4th protest in Beijing. So he was a major leader of the May 1st movement. So I will move to conclusion quickly. And basically from Kang Youwei to Chen Tuxi's Chinese democracy, it basically changed from Western-style institutional democracy to the individual liberalism against the family system, against the state authorities. So when the national crisis appeared in 1919, this kind of individual liberalism was incorporated into a collective action against the warlord state in national crisis. So this kind of collective action called for the collectivism-based Chinese nationalism that actually was influenced by Liang Qizhou, as we knew, and especially for Liang Qizhou's proposed peoples-based polity, basically for a strong and centralized government for national salvation. From Kang Youwei to Chen Tuxi's Chinese science, it basically turned from Western original scientific instruments to the Western original scientific outlook. So later I could call it Marxism, because Marxism does include the so-called scientific analysis of social evolution from primitive society to slave society, feudal society, capitalist society, and then communist society. And that led to the rise of so-called scientific communism that actually was based on popular nationalism, mainly for the building a strong and modern China. That was still under Liang Qizhou's influence. So my conclusion actually has 3 points. First, the May 4th movement reflected not only the variations on enlightenment and national salvation, it actually was also variations on new culture and older culture. And second, the May 4th movement produced a new culture only in the sense there was a cultural change from older to new culture, from the pre-1915 era to the post-1915 era. And third, The main force movement should not only the cultural continuity of old culture in the new cultural movement, but also actually led to the cultural continuity for the next century until today. For example, more later defined the People's Republic in China as a democratic dictatorship. So this actually was similar idea as Liang Qizhao's people-based polity. And recently, the former Chinese Communist General Secretary Jiang Zemin proposed the idea called three representatives, but this actually is similar idea to Liang Qizhao's idea of the people's-based polity without the institutional democracy. And Hu Jintao also proposed the scientific outlook on development of humanism, but actually this is a similar idea as Chen Duxiu's Mr. Science, and eventually Xi Jinping's idea about the Zhongguomeng or Chinese dream actually still reflects the same popular nationalism for strong, rich, and modern China that developed from the May 4th period. Yeah, sorry, my speech is long.
Okay, over to, right.
Thank you.
This is a bit like the 3-minute thesis, only that faculty do it hard for them to do.
Yeah, we're no good at technique.
No, I know. Okay, Dr. King.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be going back over one of the most celebrated moments in the early history of the Chinese Enlightenment. It's a little story that is probably known to all of you who are Chinese, but maybe worth going through again and drawing some lessons from. It happened not in 1919, but 1906, not in China, but in Japan. We are in a classroom in Sendai Medical College. A lecture on microbiology has just finished with a few minutes to spare, and the professor shows his students a recent photograph as a slide projector slide. This is a new technology and enables him to show a large picture, like sort of thing we're going to have here, in front of his class. A brief summary of where we are. We are in the Russo-Japanese War. The picture is of the Russo-Japanese War, the first modern war in which an Asian power defeated a European power. Most of the land battles of that war were fought in China, and the photograph is of a moment in that war in China. A Chinese citizen has been arrested, accused of spying for the Russians, and the Japanese are going to execute him. The students all applaud. They are, after all, Japanese, and this is something in which they take national pride. All but one of them, it seems. That one is a Chinese student called Zhou Shirin. Here is a picture of him in Japanese attire with a distinctively Japanese-style mustache from the early 1900s. He is there as one of a large number of Chinese students who go to study overseas at the end of the Qing dynasty. Many of them went to Europe, some went to America. Liu Xuan reports that he went to Japan because it was cheaper and his family had few resources. He's studying medicine in Japan because of his revulsion with Chinese traditional medicine, which he blames for the death of his father and the bankrupting of his family, which was well on the way to bankruptcy already, it must be said. He has decided that modern medicine and modern science is the way for him to change China. He's in for a shock, however. We do not know what the actual photo was, but this is one that may be rather like it. I apologize for the rather unpleasant content. This is a Chinese citizen being executed by a Japanese soldier with a crowd of observers standing behind. The Japanese students who are so enthusiastic are looking at what is happening in the foreground. Liu Xuan is looking at what is happening in the background. And he is seeing his fellow citizens gleefully looking at the entertainment of seeing somebody having his head cut off, regardless of the fact that that person is Chinese and the person doing the head cutting is Japanese. Liu Xuan reflects on this. Here's a later picture of the incident where the young Liu Xuan, moustacheless, as you see, is seen storming out of the lecture room. His own memoir does not include this moment, but it is so well known from later history that I thought I'd throw in the picture. Here's Liu Xuan's conclusion. There's really no point in learning how to cure people if they are still, he says, well, in the translation, intellectually feeble. Their loss to the world would be no cause to regret, he says. And this is why Liu Xuan gives up studying medicine and decides instead to pursue literature. The endeavor is a total failure for its first attempt, which is his translation of some selected foreign stories into Chinese, which nobody buys. He falls into a deep depression. He doesn't return to China for another decade. And it is only in about 1917 that he is persuaded to write literature himself. He reports in his memoir, the memoir that begins his first book of short stories, written, 16 years after the event in Sendai. He recalls that a friend comes to him and asks him to write for a new magazine, that new magazine being New Youth. Liu Xuan's first reaction is, what's the point? And his friend says, that this is a magazine which will stir people's consciousness. At which Liu Xuan comes up with one of the great metaphors of May the 4th. Imagine an iron house, he says. An iron house in which, by implication, the entire Chinese people are trapped. They are slowly suffocating to death. What's the point of waking them up so that they understand what is happening to them? His friend says, but if you wake them up, some of them might do something about it. And so he writes his first short story, which Zhongping was talking about, which is called The Diary of a Madman. And here we have one of the second great metaphors of the Chinese Enlightenment, which is that society is cannibalistic, that the whole tradition of China, and for Liu Xuan, this begins with Chinese medicine and expands into Chinese philosophy, Chinese rulership. All of these aspects of traditional Chinese culture are cannibalistic and have to be done away with. It's important to note the loathing of traditional Chinese culture that Liu Xuan has, and which many of the practitioners of the Chinese Enlightenment had. They didn't just dislike it, they were a creature of it, but yet they hated it. It's a funny position to be in. Here's one final picture, and this is a picture of Liu Xuan's, shall we say, embodiment of all that he saw as being wrong with the Chinese people. Perhaps his most famous short story is called A.Q. Zhangzhuan, the true story of A.Q., and it presents this character who is, I went through various of his characteristics. He is cowardly, weak, dishonest, and self-deluding. And this is what Liu Xuan saw the Chinese nation as being. And in this, he is clearly influenced by the work of Western writers like Arthur Smith, who slammed the Chinese people. Arthur Smith had never met anybody Chinese who wasn't basically a household servant or somebody who was a rice Christian. But he had no opinion of them, and Liu Xuan astonishingly appeared to share that opinion. So the Chinese Enlightenment, if Enlightenment it is springing from a desire, to flush out all of that Chinese tradition. And if I might be permitted in my last couple of minutes, I would like to reflect on how the Chinese Enlightenment has been remembered and how it is currently recalled. Enlightenment, it would seem to me, seems to flourish only when you have governments which are transitional, remote, weak, or divided. Strong governments, dictatorships, don't like freedom of ideas. They don't like enlightenment. And so if we look at the various commemorations of the May the 4th movement, in the Mao era, it was venerated as being a precursor of the Communist Revolution, and Liu Xuan was lionized as a hero of that revolution. However, the kind of things that were believed and were practiced by the May the 4th intellectuals really had no place in Mao's China. If there was a moment when May the 4th values threatened to resurface, it was perhaps at the time of the 60th anniversary in 1979, when I think with some sincerity, various members of the Chinese Communist Party, and I think particularly of Zhou Yang, resurfacing after a rather long time out of service, talked about liberation of the mind. 解放思想, where 思想 means not only the mind and thinking, but also ideology. So at that moment, at the beginning of the period which is now thought of as Chinese high culture fever, a decade which ended in June of 1989, you do have a potential perhaps for a revitalization of the May the 4th period. In the last couple of days, the current president of China has come up also with his thoughts on how May 4th should be remembered. And those of you who are young and Chinese, be patriotic and hardworking, because that for Xi Jinping is the lesson of May the 4th. All of those things that Xi Jinping does not permit, including things like diversity of ideas and talk about various systems of government, all of those things are out. But the May the 4th still has to be honored. I think it is a rather sad state of affairs, and we should not necessarily be cheery about the 100th anniversary of the May 4th movement. And on that happy note, I pass off to Angie.
It's the one on the right. Thank you. Okay, so to follow up on Richard's talk, I'll be speaking about the legacy of Liu Xing and how Liu Xing remains relevant to understanding aspects of contemporary Chinese society today. So this semester, when I asked my students in my Chinese literature class which Chinese writer they think has the most distinctive style, most of them automatically responded Liu Xing. And I think the confidence that students express toward knowing Liu Xing's writing is part of the literary legacy that has been passed down from the socialist period. The persistence of Liu Xing reminds me of a story that Yuhua has talked about in relationship to his childhood growing up during the Cultural Revolution. And he talks about how, as a first grader, he believed that there was only one prose author in the world, Liu Xing, and one poet, Mao Zedong. And the passage that you see up here, he writes, every great author needs great readers, and for Liu Xing to have such an influential reader as Mao Zedong may have been his good fortune, or it may have been his bad luck. So Yuhua's point here is that this reader-author relationship depends on timing, on a reader finding the perfect moment to encounter a particular author's work. In the case of Liu Xing, his most famous works, such as Diary of a Madman and The True Story of A.Q., These are stories that are associated with the May 4th movement and the pressing issue of national salvation. For today's readers, who often prefer their literature to be less obviously political, his consistently satirical critique can oftentimes seem harsh and overbearing by more universal aesthetic standards. It seems to me that there have been two main ways of interpreting Liu Xun's relevance. Most commonly, this is the belief that Liu Xun transcends all time. His writing can be applied to universal issues and themes beyond their time and place of origin. So this is the view shared by Yu Hua, for example. And then on the other hand, there is also the polar opposite opinion. It's less common, but nonetheless, it was voiced back in 1928 by the writer Chi Cheung, who argued that, quote, Liu Xun's creative works do not have a modern flavor and cannot represent the modern age. He was talking about the story of AQ that Richard just mentioned. So what he meant was that the China that Liu Xun was writing about in his May 4th era fiction is an outdated China that is more fitting with the late Qing past. So today I'm proposing a middle ground, and I'd like to point out what I see as the four main ways in which Liu Xun's writing remains relevant to thinking about and understanding contemporary Chinese society. So the first point is related to the tension between his celebration of cosmopolitanism and this idea of patriotic nationalism, which Richard mentioned in this kind of formative experience that he had as a Chinese student studying abroad in Japan. As Richard also mentioned, there's been a lot of media press surrounding the 100 commemoration event in Beijing. And this is taken from part of the speech that Xi Jinping made, which picks up on this sense of patriotism in his praise of May 4th as an anti-imperialist patriotic movement. The emphasis here is on the youth demographic's duty in transforming China, which is nothing new in terms of discourse, but this has been remarked on by most media outside of China, and the kind of irony hasn't been lost. I kind of see an echo of the selective borrowing, the 拿来主义 that Liu Xun often referred to, which was specifically in reference to borrowing from foreign elements and seeing which kind of fits with transforming Chinese culture. But of course, this movement's original context of student protest has been completely removed, so I'm sure we'll hear a little bit more about that. The second way in which Liu Xun's writing remains relevant today is his attention to the theme of social disparity, which has been seen as a defining trait of China's rapid development. So in works of fiction like The True Story of AQ, Kong Yiji, and Zhufu, New Year's Sacrifice, he comments on problems related to gender inequality and social class that yet remain to be resolved in contemporary society today. So we can see on here, this is one of the memes that became popular in 2015, where the term 赵家人, 赵 family from AQ became widely circulated online as a way to explain the social disparity between those with political connections in contemporary Chinese society and the disenfranchised majority. So referring to AQ's master in the story, who taunts him, how could you be named Zhao? How could you even deserve to be named Zhao? We see the phrase repeated here in this internet meme, demonstrating again this idea that Liu Xun has this kind of timelessness. Okay, and third, in what is currently being hailed right now as the heyday of Chinese science fiction, it's notable that Liu Xun was one of the first translators of Western science fiction into Chinese. So while he was in Japan, he translated Jules Verne's From the Earth to the Moon in 1903 and Voyage to the Center of the Earth in 1906. These were texts that had been translated from French into Japanese, and he was able to translate from Japanese into Chinese. And so readers today who are only familiar with web literature and maybe Liu Cixin's three-body series, they might be surprised to discover that late Qing and Republican era writers started translating and writing science fiction in China well over a decade ago. There have also been very persuasive, convincing readings of Diary of a Madman, for example, as not being a work of realist fiction, but rather that it demonstrates aspects of the supernatural and otherworldly, so that there are ways of reading that story as well as a work of science fiction. And Liu Xuan himself believed that the popularization of science could cure China at the beginning of the 20th century. So for him, this was a project that was in the name of social evolution. And we can see echoes of this now in the Chinese government's, recurrent interest in popularizing science fiction and the development of a science fiction industry that is trying to integrate literary, electronic gaming, film, and other culture industries as a way to generate domestic profit while ideally also accruing world prestige. So the fourth and last point I want to raise today is Liu Xuan's faith in culture, specifically in art and literature, as a tool for human social transformation. So in his famous Iron House metaphor, which Richard explained to us, we can see him debating the value of trying to wake these people who are on the verge of suffocating to death with little chance that they can survive. The images, some of the ones that I've put up here, are from a cartoon titled, "If You Want to Learn How to Hate People, Find Zhou Shuren and Liu Xuan." And the panel that you see up here is illustrating how to respond to older people who are insisting on younger families having a second child. And in response, Liu Xuan has a quote from Diary of Madman saying, "Just because it has always been this way doesn't make it right." So for Liu Xuan, the worst possibility that a writer can encounter is not opposition, but being faced with apathy or no reaction whatsoever. Today, we are surrounded by lamentations about the crisis faced by the humanities and developments in automation. In China, the literary sphere is plagued with a continuous debate about commercialism versus literary quality. So we see here that Liu Xuan, the ultimate cynic, was able to remain hopeful about the power of human creativity as a way to inspire change. And hopefully from these images that continue to be created, we can see that his writing has continued to serve that purpose. So in conclusion, I still wonder about Liu Xuan's reputation as the greatest modern Chinese writer, or the father of modern Chinese literature. These are two of the most commonly used labels to describe him. And I'm wondering if it is as simple as the Lingnan professor Xu Zidong has put it, that 国内 mainland Chinese readers love Liu Xuan in the same way that overseas 外国 Chinese language readers from outside of mainland China love Zhang Ailing. How can we make sense of the fact that many, if not most, Chinese language readers from outside of mainland China are unfamiliar with this literary giant that is seen in the world literature sphere as the representative voice of modern China? Starting in the 1960s in Western academia and continuing through the early 1980s after the Cultural Revolution, there has been a consistent effort to rewrite modern Chinese literary and cultural history in the wake of the socialist past. So much of this rewriting process has been focused on trying to decenter the role of the May 4th movement and Liu Xuan as its figurehead. But I think at the same time that literary critics have tirelessly worked to expand the scope of writers and creative works to include more women authors, previously marginalized media forms such as music, film, and popular culture. Also, there has been an increase in Sinophone literature, recognizing writing from places like Singapore, Malaysia, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. It still remains really difficult to kind of shake off the influence of Liu Xuan. So I think it is only through this kind of ongoing project of rewriting and the passing of time that Liu Xuan's lasting power will be determined. Thank you.
Now go over to Great Blue right
Oh, I thought we were going to do Guoguang first, no?
No.
It would be useful to have
would you like
Guoguang go
Guoguang
first.
first?
Yes, I think that would be,
Okay.
because he's going to say some things that I can
That you
play
need
off
to
of
have
then.
said first.
Yeah,
Okay. All right. Guoguang, over to you. Do you have a PowerPoint?
I will talk about politics. As Zhongping already introduced that, so I don't need to talk about historical fact about May 4th, 1919. But the picture was really interesting because there you could see, so they called for National Assembly. So actually, at that time, when students they protested against the weak government of Beijing, they called for democracy. So I don't want to go to the detail about why they protest. Zhongping already introduced that. So anyway, the protest really marked upsurge of modern Chinese nationalism. This nationalism is closely associated with calling for democracy. So from the slogan, the students they actively upholding, you could say they called for defending national sovereignty in foreign affairs and eliminating nation rivals in domestic politics. So when they found that China was weak, China was actively not powerful in international politics and was humiliated in international politics, so they had some kind of inward reflection to criticize the Chinese regime, to criticize the Chinese political system. So they thought that democracy would save China from this kind of humiliation. So that's why Mr. Democracy and Mr. Science were later summarized as the spirit of May 4th movement. The CCP, as Zhongping already mentioned, actually claimed the heir to May 4th. According to official statement, the May 4th movement prepared ideas and also leaders, organizational resources for the establishment of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921. Yes, the Chinese Communist Party for a long time, at least before 1949, advocated democracy and also nationalism. Before taking national power, particularly in Yan'an period in 1940s, so you could say actually, the organ newspaper of Chinese Communist Party, Xinhua Ribao, published series of articles, editorials to advocate democracy in China. Here a quotation said, KMT, Nationalist Party, the ruling party at that time of China, said, KMT said, China cannot practice democracy because that will cause chaos. And the Communist Party said, that's actually just a really bad defense of dictatorship and authoritarianism in China. Also, 解放日报, published in Yan'an, the Central Committee of CCP's masterpiece, published a series of articles like that. Mao Zedong actually wrote many of those articles. When I was actually political commentator of People's Daily, we were told that, the job had been done by Chairman Mao, and now you follow to do that. So a lot of articles to increase of democracy actually were from Chairman Mao. And Mao said, China has some shortcomings, and most of that shortcoming is actually the absence of democracy. The CCP said something like that in 1940s for some politically practical purposes, for fighting against nationalist party, authoritarian regime, and also try to win actually, FDR in international politics in mid-1940s. At that time in Yan'an, walls, you could see those political slogans like we want popular election, things like that. Actually today, Chinese internet users said, could we do something today in China? You could got really big trouble. Anyway, so in 1991, actually, one of my friends in China, a journalist, he co-edited, a collection of those articles reprinted those articles from those old Chinese, CCP newspapers as a hero of the history. So Chinese Communist Party's Democratic Commission. Immediately, this book was banned in China by the Chinese Communist Party in 1990s. So, making the long story short, so today you could say Chinese nationalism is basically against democracy. So from those also anti-Japanese demonstrations, you could say something. The slogans are really violent. Here I found, slogan says, even we have actively everywhere in China, we have a grievance. We would like to kill all those Japanese guys. And here, so they are all good. We prefer to actively defending our Diaoyu Island, disputable maritime territory in East China Sea, between China and Japan, the Diaoyu Island. So we prefer to defending our sovereignty over the Diaoyu Island to actively the whole earth. No grass can grow in whole earth. And not only so violent, but also because we support the government. So that's government associated attitude when they advocate nationalism, and particularly against democracy. As the slogan said, 哪怕天天被代表，也要收复钓鱼岛。then 被代表 basically means that being represented in China means not really democratically. Being represented means somebody pretend to present you actively. You have no participation. So basically, I would like to translate this slogan as we have no any opportunity to participate in politics. So still, we want our Diaoyu Island back to China. So why they actively put these two things in confrontation? So basically, if you really want democracy, a big problem. So we need to really, explain why this change from Nationalist Democracy Association that actually followed, Western path of nationalism, rise in, for example, in France. Actually, scholars of nationalism, they argue that with the French Revolution, actually democracy and nationalism rose hand in hand, because when you feel that you are a citizen of this country, so you want your actively participation in national power. So that's why a very famous book about French political history is entitled "From Peasant to Frenchman." And because when you feel that you are Frenchman, so you want to be joining the French Revolution. But now in China, why this difference? I would like to say, this picture was taken in Toronto. So not only those Chinese people, they protest against the Japanese guys in Beijing, in Shanghai, in Guangzhou, also in, not in Victoria yet, maybe tomorrow. Anyway, in Vancouver and in Toronto. So yes, China's ascendance as global power really inspires Chinese population's identification with the authority state against foreign countries. So yes, we are very powerful. So why should we actively accepting those Western ideas like democracy? And also, when you do that, within China, you think you can do this kind of anti-democracy nationalist demonstration. Still, the government is highly vigilant to continue actively demonstration like that. So basically, the police guy wouldn't put you into jail when you say something, patriotic, against democracy, we want the Diaoyu Island. So nationalism as relatively safe, legitimate voice, operating in China's supervision political circumstances. You can see sometimes. And also post-Tiananmen, nationalistic, I don't want to use that term, brainwashing or propaganda, but anyway, indoctrination, in China also work. So yes, as Zhongping just mentioned, China's century-long pursuit of wealth and power, the Chinese dream. Today you have already realized your China dream. So why should you want democracy? But actively, between 1990 to this year, over those 100 years, we find that before 1949, there was actively specific historical stage. And 1989, because Patrick Brown is not here today, and he plans to talk about student activism in China, I feel, as political scientist, also, sympathy to democracy, I should, supply something. Actually, in 1989, 30 years ago, when Chinese students, they protested, they called for democracy. Why they want to memorize CCP leader Hu Yaobang? Because they regarded Hu Yaobang as actively, 民主之光, light of democracy, not because he was communist leader. And also they said, Mr. Democracy, hello, Mr. Democracy. Yes, yeah, directly, heritage from May 4th movement in 1990. And they said, okay, democracy is our, common, actively, commitment vision. And exactly, you can see that. They talk about May 4th, and about democracy. So in 1989, democracy was actively very closely associated with students' demand, so-called, they also call them patriotic. So you could see there are two May 4th today, okay, nationalistic May 4th or democratic May 4th. And when those Chinese leaders, Angie just showed a picture with better quality. So the day before yesterday, those leaders assembled in the great hall of people to celebrate May 4th movement. And at the same time, those students in Beijing, they came to the meeting place that was really privileged. You could be there. But look, they were taking nap. So forum title, China's Weakening of 100 Years, I suggested that. But if you look at the picture, China is weakening? No, let me take a nap. Okay. Okay, I stop here. Thank you.
Okay, over to you, Craig.
Okay, thank you, Helen. So I'm going to be the odd one out here, it seems, because I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, but I'm just going to give you words. I've titled this, as people might have seen on the poster, Rethinking the TwoWay Street, John Dewey in China. I told my son on the weekend that I was going to be talking about John Dewey in China, and he said, oh, is that the guy who invented the library classification systems? So can I just ask, how many people know who John Dewey was? Not that many. Okay, so he was probably the leading American philosopher in the first half of the 20th century. And he was the first of a series of foreign intellectual leaders to visit China in the post-World War I era. He was followed by Bertrand Russell, by Albert Einstein, by Teilhard de Chardin, by Rabindranath Tagore, who was Indian Nobel Prize winner, Arnold Toynbee, and a series of others. All of them were brought into China in the post-World War I period to help enlighten the people that were listening to them and to modernize China's intellectual culture. And I called the paper Rethinking a Two-Way Street because in all the cases there was a process of the foreign experts coming in and talking to Chinese audiences, bringing their expertise, but in all cases there was also a learning from China as well. And especially in the case of Dewey, there's been a rethinking of what that process involved in both directions. So in some ways, this presentation is a kind of reflection on the role of the foreign experts going into China and what kind of role and impact they could actually have at this point. All of them were sharing their ideas and learning from the situation of the people of China. Some had a broader influence, some had less influence, some was narrow. Bertrand Russell, for example, another famous philosopher, is credited with introducing mathematical logic into China, right, which is an important field, but fairly narrow. Albert Einstein is credited with introducing Chinese students to nuclear science, which was important because some of the people who came to the United States to study with him at Princeton afterwards were involved in later development of Chinese atomic weaponry and Chinese atomic energy. So that's in some ways a very technical field, but it has big impact. John Dewey was probably one of the most broadly influential Western thinkers to visit China, influential before 1950. After 1950, he was banned, and there was a major campaign in the early 50s against his thought. But he was unique among the people who visited China from the West, in that he had actually trained Chinese students previously at Columbia University, including Hu She, who's already been spoken about by Zhongping, and other people, other leading intellectuals who were important in the interwar period, such as Jiang Manlin and Tao Xingzhe. So, as I said, the impact of the foreign intellectuals in China is being reconsidered. Let me just say a few words. Victor, you're going to keep me on time, right? About the visit of John Dewey. So Dewey arrived on the 1st of May, 1919, just a century ago yesterday, with his wife Alice, who was a known feminist writer. He arrived on the invitation from the president of Peking National University, as it was then called in English, Tsai Ing-wen, and on the urging of two young faculty members, namely Chen Du-shu, who Zhongping also spoke about, who was the editor of New Youth magazine, and Hu She, who had studied at Columbia with Dewey. Dewey was the first major Western thinker ever to visit China, and there was huge enthusiasm. He was known especially for, he wrote on a wide range of subjects, but he was known especially for writing on relationships between democracy and science. And those two things had been, along with anti-Confucianism, watchwords of the new cultural movement that had been in place been going on since 1915. And in some ways, one could say, that Dewey was Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy in the eyes of many people. And the excitement around his visit was characterized time by a term, Dewey fever, widespread throughout intellectual circles among scholars, teachers, students within China. And it was a period of great upheaval. He arrived on the 1st of May. The May 4th movement broke out after Liang Qichau's telegram arrived 3 days later. The movement amazed and galvanized Dewey himself. He was astonished by it. He didn't know that. He knew Chinese students. He knew something about Chinese traditional culture, but this was his first visit, and suddenly students all over the country were demonstrating against both the decision by the representatives of the victorious powers from the Great War in Paris to give control of Shandong province to Japan after it had been taken away from the Germans, after the sphere of influence had been taken away from the Germans, and protesting against the government of the day, the Duan Shirai government, the Beiyang government, which was accepting this kind of decision, and so were considered national traitors by the students who had sympathy across Chinese society. Dewey and his wife ended up spending 2 years in China, and in terms of the two-way street, that experience was crucial in his evolution of his thinking. He ended up revising his own theories on a number of major subjects, including in relation to the role of what constituted racial difference. He was never a biological racist, but he had cultural racist traits that he lost through encountering people in China. He revised his notion of culture, moving to a position where he had felt culture was always a reactionary inhibitor to change, to seeing culture as something that had both positive and negative sides. In other words, he was arguing to some extent against the kind of essentialization of Chinese culture that was going on during the May 4th movement. He revised his theory in relation to the state and the nature of the state, in relation to democracy, and in relation to international relations, arguing that positive international relations had to be built on improved cultural understanding. So one of the important things about Dewey's time in China was that he wrote a major series of articles that were published in the American press. And these were important for shifting, I would argue, the perception of China in the West from being a passive victim of foreign aggression and a cultural backwater to China being an international historical actor, or at least important parts of the Chinese population. He was particularly enthusiastic about the students, who he praised for their bravery, but he wrote on a whole range of topics, including critiques of militarism, both Chinese warlord militarism, Japanese militarism, other foreign powers militarism, to the civil war between the different warlord factions within China. Dewey's impact on China has always been taken as being limited. It's now being rethought. For one thing, it's recently been realized by looking at the transcriptions we have in Chinese of what his interpreters presented as his ideas in his lectures, and his recently found original typescripts that he typed himself, that there was a great discrepancy between what he was saying and what the translators gave out. I don't have time, unfortunately, this time either. Helen asked me a question about this the other day. But let's just suffice it to say there was a very significant differences between his own ideas as he presented them and what was presented. For example, he argued that education involved creative self-realization of every individual. Hu Xia, his major translator in North China, said education means that all the ignoramuses can be given jobs. So a very utilitarian take. Nonetheless, the influence that Dewey had was especially strong in the educational field, and it's now clear from research being done in Shanghai, elsewhere in the Jiangnan, that there was a positive uptake and positive reception of his ideas in South China, much more than in North China, from the throughout his time, throughout his 2 years within China. I won't say more in detail about that. But what we have learned is that the role of foreign expert going into China the impact depends very much on the way their particular thought is accepted. His view of democracy was that you had to, not introducing formal state mechanisms, he said what's important is to build a democratic culture up from the grassroots, with people who are educated to be critical and creative thinkers. And can be argued that that's still an issue that's on the agenda in China today. Thanks very much.
Last but not least, yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking maybe I should just sit here to make it easier, because people will be looking at that and then I'm talking here. But then I realized maybe the younger generation of Chinese need to stand up. Okay, so I will have to say, in the last 2 weeks I was so busy with Zhongping's conference, and if you don't enjoy my talk, or if you find any typo, there is all Zhongping's fault. It's not my fault. There you go. So here are two pictures of the traditional Chinese family. I know if I bring up the idea of traditional Chinese family, this is what most people will be thinking about. It's like the whole family living within the same household is called 5 or 4 generations of males under the floor. So according to this idea, a father and his sons, his grandsons, and his great-grandsons and their wives remained together in the same household. And this traditional Chinese family is, of course, only an ideal type, because, in fact, in many families which were not as rich, they may not have meet the requirement of this kind of family. And as Zhongping just mentioned, at that time, marriage was often arranged by parents to meet the family's needs, such as producing the next generation. And love at that time, personal romantic love and pressure between the two were not that important. It was not as important as the survival of the whole family. And love may just refer to the notion of favor and gratitude between husband and wife, with an emphasis on gratitude. So current studies show that the new cultural movement in the late 1910s was the first turning point in the history for Chinese families. The second was believed to be the marriage law in 1950s, and then it was the one-child policy, as Helen just mentioned, 40 years ago. But don't worry, I'm not going to talk about all of them. So the first turning point in history is it was the new cultural movement. It was 100 years ago, and the new cultural movement elites, they blend arranged the arranged marriage and the patriarchal control of Chinese youth. And during that time, they introduced the Western conceptions of romantic love, and they rejected the traditional family ideal of 5 or 4 generations under one roof, and they advocated to replace the Chinese traditional joint family with a Western family ideal, namely 小家庭 or small family. And they also condemned the traditional patriarchal family for sacrificing the youth independence and their creative energy for filial piety or filial obligation. And they promoted free choice marriage, and they advocated that the Chinese youth should be independent from the large family or the 大家庭. But the question becomes why? Why were they advocating for a family reform? In fact, those May 4th elites, they aim to use family reform as a way to unlock the potential of Chinese youth to enhance the national spirit. They consider the free choice marriage as the indispensable first step towards dismantling the system of oppressive patriarchal authority. It is clear that those elites, they were not simply they were not simply copying from the West. They are doing this because they want to replace the traditional patriarchal family with the 小家庭 as a response to imperialist invention and to build a stronger nation. So individualism was by no means the aim of the family revolution, the family reform in the new cultural movement. And then the question becomes why the CCP, why the party, like Chinese party, like the family reform discourse, they must have something to benefit from there. So the 小家庭 idea, or the small family idea, was very appealing to them. because it emphasizes the importance of a powerful nation, and the family reform discourse, they employ the idea that the state should take up the responsibility for formulating changes and judging all behaviors and customs. So this, is, in a sense, justify the state's authority to forbid critical thinking and independent action. So according to Susan Grosser, the reformers welcome state intervention and willingly subordinated individual rights to the demand of the state in return for its promise to save China. So the reliance on the state to save the nation and the belief that the survival of the state was the most important thing overrode the rights of individuals. And as you can see there, this kind of nationalism, this belief has continued into today's China. Deploying by this family reform discourse was deployed by the state to justify its control over individual rights, over individual choices in family and in childbearing. The most significant example in my mind was the one-child policy and the recent change to the two-child policy. And in order to control its size of population, as Helen just mentioned, the one-child policy was introduced like 40 years ago. And as you can see from the picture there is a close linkage between the building of a stronger nation and the population control. For example, at the top, it says everybody has the responsibility to help build a stronger nation, and me or individuals should take part in the population control. And at the bottom there, it says we need to give birth to fewer children and ensure the quality of the children as a way to build a stronger nation. Professor Kim might have a better translation for that because I know you have. So you can also see the idea of family in those two pictures. And here are more pictures if you are interested. Here it says, do a good job in family planning to promote economic development. So the introduction of the one-child policy makes nuclear family the custom here, especially in urban areas in China. Within 4 decades, the one-child policy indeed changed the idea of family among ordinary people. People are no longer talking about having more sons means more fortune, which was a very popular expression in the past. But of course, this kind of family structure has some potential problems. For example, if the state refuses to take care of the aging population, then it is almost impossible for the 2 adults to carry up the whole household with 4 aging parents and then 1 child. So once again, 4 years ago, the CCP changed the one-child policy to a universal 2-child policy to address the aging issue in China. So the state does not only use social media, propaganda, and the law, but those kind of things are kind of everywhere. As you can see there, People's Daily says having children not only matters to the family, but also matters to the state. And the CCP saw the need to reshape the idea of family, and all of a sudden the idea of family promoted in the media looks like this. We can see from picture that they try to convey the message that what a perfect, happy family looks like is you need to have 2 children. And here more, like right before the change to 2-child policy, that was the national stamp for the year of monkey. You can see there are 2 baby monkeys here. And then this year, for the year of the pig, they have 3. So people started to think, oh, maybe China will soon allow people to give birth to more, not only 3 children, because 3 in China means like many. So let's see what happens. And it seems I don't have time to cover everything, but as you can see in this picture now, it's like the government tries to educate people to take care of the different generations. They encourage people to live in the same building or to live in the same neighborhood, which will allow you to kind of rely on your parents and your children to meet the task of real life. So just to conclude, now you can see how the state used the family reform discourse put forward in the new cultural movement to define and redefine the idea of family in today's China. So I will probably conclude that this is 100 years history of sacrificing the rights of individuals and individual families for the interests of the state. Thank you.